Yes, another very warm welcome and thanks for coming back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Yes, thanks for coming back. It's me again, Chris here with Classic Dirt Bike TV as we continue to showcase more of those old school vintage race bikes that we used to ride from way back in the day. Now, just a quick heads up to what's coming up here in the coming weeks and months here on my channel. Now, our first event of 2025, which we'll be covering, will be the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show on the 8th and 9th of February, and of course Classic Dirt Bike will be there to cover all of the bikes from that two-day event, and you can see most of those machines here on my channel soon after. So if you haven't already subscribed to Classic Dirt Bike TV, then now would be a very good time to do that small thing. But right now we're going to take a look at a bike that I came across quite a few years ago now, but I forgot I'd even had this machine in my video archives, so we're going to take a look at it now. So let's jump straight into that video and take a look at this lovely 1979 Curtis XR500 Honda. Right, okay, so it's been quite a while since we've featured a four-stroke twin-shocker here on my channel, and in the past we've certainly shown you quite a good mix of these kind of old-school four-stroke racers, and this featured bike here is a bike that I came across while I was at a Scottish Classic race event at Finhaven in Forfar back in 2018. Now, the bike at the time I grabbed these clips and pictures belonged to a local man called Dougie Harrow, who's had quite a nice variety of these four-stroke scramblers during his racing career. And when I came across this bike at Forfar, I remember Dougie did say that he'd only recently bought the bike, and this particular race event at Forfar was going to be its inaugural baptism when he'd eventually get a chance to put the bike on the track for the very first time. Anyhow, as you can see, our featured machine is a 1979 Honda XR500, which obviously has that fantastic XR500 four-stroke Honda engine to power it, but the chassis isn't, of course, your run-of-the-mill standard Honda XR trail bike frame that's normally associated with these XRs. This bike's particular skeleton is another very high quality chassis built by the legendary Brian Curtis. But just in case you're not too familiar with Brian's work, Brian was a well-respected and quite famous motocross rider in his own right back in the 1960s, who, as I remember, started off his bike building career working for the likes of the Rickman brothers of Don and Derek Rickman before moving on to work with various other companies, while eventually settling down to manufacture his own motorcycle chassis in 1972. And it was around this time that Brian Curtis also brought on board Gary Woodhouse, who did quite a lot of the welding on these early Curtis frames. So maybe in our case here, there's still a good chance that even this frame could have been manufactured by Gary Woodhouse. Because as I said, Gary did do quite a lot of the construction on these early Scrambles chassis, but as far as I know, Curtis bikes have now moved away from building motocross frames to concentrate on the BMX cycle chassis market, which is a bit of a shame really, because their workmanship is without doubt certainly up there at the top end of the quality league, and their frames are still in very high demand across the globe. So in a way, we're quite lucky to have come across this quite rare example of one of these early Curtis motocross frames. So the information I got from the owner of this bike on the day I grabbed these pictures was that this is indeed a Curtis chassis, which I'm told was made in 1979, and the bike's owner also told me that this is said to be one of the very early Curtis scrambles frames, mainly because this chassis here was actually MIG welded rather than bronze or braze welded, which were Curtis's much more preferred method of construction in their later years. But this steel tubular frame was very strong and of course made from top quality steel tubing that had this quite substantial front down tube that was heavily gusseted at the yoke, or the triple clamp part of the chassis at the top, and here at the bottom part of the frame it then split into two tubular rungs that formed a kind of cradle type structure that ran underneath the engine, as you can see here in this particular shot. And here at the back of our Curtis frame, the swing arm was also quite well constructed, which again was made of substantial steel tubing with an extra kind of strengthening plate welded along its top section, which also of course doubled up as part of the swing arm's bottom rear shock mount. But as per all of the other important parts of this Curtis chassis, this rear swing arm was absolutely bulletproof, and reports of any kind of flexing or cracks in these parts were virtually non-existent during its lifetime. Now, some of the smaller parts that are fitted onto our Curtis motorcycle chassis are these strong and ultra-wide foot pegs, which are a much more sensible option than those skinny items that manufacturers continue to fix onto their off-roaders, and even now in these modern times are still fixing skinny pegs. But when Brian Curtis was putting this chassis together, there was no question that he was going to fit the best quality footrest that he could lay his hands on at the time. And these items here will offer much needed support for the rider's legs and his feet. So as we move on to our power plant that's fitted inside our Curtis frame now, if you're going to build a four-stroke thumper motocrosser, then you're going to need an engine that's both powerful, easy to maintain, tunable, and more importantly, very reliable and as tough as an anvil. And while this XR500 Honda ticks all of those boxes, it's still an engine that was originally made for a much more mundane Honda road and trail bike, but it wasn't too long before off-road racers then got wind of these engines' reliability and their suitability as a full-blown motocross engine, that they then began stripping off all of the road-going paraphernalia from their XR trail bikes to enable them to use these bikes and engines as their weekend race machines at local scrambles or motocross race meetings. But as you know, not every single XR500 engine was actually constructed in Japan, as quite a few of these Thumper XRs were assembled all over the globe, although their fantastic engineering and quality components still assured them as the perfect four-banger engine to pop into your enduro or scrambles chassis, which is another reason that Brian Curtis chose it on this motorcycle design for that year. But basically these XR500s were just a single cylinder 4-stroke with a single overhead cam, and although it had just a one-pot cylinder with a 4-valve head, it also had a twin exhaust port cylinder head as well. Now, originally these XRs were fitted with a balancer shaft that rotated in the opposite direction of the crankshaft's rotation, which was just to try and counteract any kind of imbalance on the crank and make the engine run nice and smooth. Although a lot of racers did remove the balancer shafts from these engines because smoothness isn't, of course, that important on a competition bike, and it also added extra weight to this engine. So taking out the balancer reduces the weight, and it also makes the motor much more responsive to the throttle as well. Now, in their stock standard trim from 1979, these XRs put out, I think it was roughly around the 36 horsepower mark. Although, of course, if you wanted to pimp your XR motor and give it a bit of an upgrade, there are still plenty trick components out there that you can bolt on to these engines that beef up the horsepower. So fitting things like bigger valves or a big bore kit and maybe a hot new camshaft certainly increased the power output considerably. Although, having said that, even in its original stock standard settings, this 500 engine had more than enough grunt for your average weekend racer. And here on the engine's transmission side, it was an oil-cooled wet multi-plate clutch that, as I remember, had 7 friction plates, unlike its smaller brother, the XR250, that I think had just the 5 plates because a much stronger clutch was required on this 500 to handle the extra power. And inside the XR's motor, we had a 5-speed gearbox, and the sparks were supplied by a relatively modern style electronic CDI, or capacitor discharge ignition system, if you want to give it its full title. But as I just mentioned, this engine here was a single cylinder, but it had this twin port exhaust cylinder head with these 2 header pipes joining into one single tailpipe that ran down the right hand side of the bike. But this big open megaphone tailpipe isn't, of course, the same part that would have been fitted to the original XR trail bike in '79. This is a custom made tail cone so that you can experience the best performance and the sound that comes from that XR thumper engine. So as we move onto the bike's front suspension, which in 1979 would have been a quite spindly pair of basic 35mm forks on the XR trail machine, which were of course no use at all on a full-blown competition bike. But you can see here that our machine has a pair of period correct Fox factory forks, which as I remember were part of the Fox Air Shocks company from the USA. And this front suspension system is definitely period correct for that year, and these forks, I think, gave the rider about 8 inches of travel here at the front end. But exactly what these units were like in terms of their performance on the track, I'm not sure, but I'll bet that they performed better and were much stronger than the 35mm ones that came from the Honda factory on the original XR. But to stop or even slow down our Curtis Honda, it was a simple drum and shoe type braking system, both here at the front and at the rear as well. And you'd think that this might have been a twin leading shoe type of brake here at the front, because this wasn't exactly a featherweight machine to bring to a standstill, but that backing plate on this front hub was again made of lightweight magnesium. But while we're still here at the front end of the bike, it's also worth mentioning that back in 1979, when Honda first launched the XR500 trail bike, they fitted a 23-inch front wheel to that bike, which was a bit weird because there wasn't even a single manufacturer at that time making replacement tyres for a 23-inch off-road motorcycle wheel. And Honda's 23-inch claw action tyre that they fitted to that original bike was said to be as hard as concrete, so it wasn't ideal for a road or even a trail bike, although thankfully our Curtis XR500 here has gone for the much more sensible option of a 21-inch front wheel, which will also give the rider much more scope when it comes to picking replacement tyres for this bike. And again here at the back, it was a Honda rear hub and drum brake, which also had a magnesium backplate, just the same as that front hub. Now, our Curtis also used a pair of these cam adjusters on the end of the rear wheel spindle to accurately adjust the rear chain tension, which was, of course, mega important to keep that rear drive chain at exactly the right tension and to allow for the up and down movement of the suspension at the back of the bike. And to soak up all of those bumps and other undulations that our Curtis may come across while blasting around the racetrack, it's a pair of top quality Works performance twin shocks that's been chosen to try and keep the back end of the bike in check. And these Works performance units, as I remember, were another product that was made in the USA. Now, with regards to their operation, these were gas and oil filled dampers that had these dual rate springs on the outside, and going by some of the feedback from riders who've used these suspension units in the past, most of them did say that they certainly did a good job, and a few others said that the Swedish-made Olin piggyback shocks were a much better option to fit onto these four-stroke thumpers. But when you consider the times, there wasn't really an awful lot of choice when it came to choosing replacement rear suspensions on your 79 XR, whereas nowadays we're absolutely spoilt for choice in terms of what's available. Anyhow, because these Curtis racers are all hand-built, naturally they use a variety of different components that are borrowed from various other manufacturers. And this alloy fuel tank here is no different in that respect, because this part here has been taken from a 1978 or 79 Honda CR250 red rocket. So this fuel cell here, when it was bolted into the 250 two-stroke Honda, would have had just over 2 gallons of pre-mixed fuel, which was usually plenty gas for a simple two-stroker, but bolted onto this Curtis frame, the fuel will probably flow a lot quicker to keep that XR500 engine happy. And in terms of rider comfort, and although I was never actually told on the day that I grabbed these shots, I'm almost 99% sure that this seat here has been also borrowed from the 250 Red Rocket as well, because as far as I'm concerned, it looks identical to the one that would have been on the smaller two-stroke 250, but even fixed onto this Curtis chassis, you can see that it fits absolutely perfectly and will hopefully have more than enough padding to satisfy even the heaviest of back sides. Now, in terms of the bike's overall aesthetic looks, I suppose Curtis could have again maybe made the plastic side panels from the Red Rocket fit this particular frame as well, but you can see they've opted to go for these handcrafted alloy side panels, which in my opinion look much nicer than the red plastic ones anyway, and these will also give the bike a much more unique identity as well, because if they'd gone for the red plastic panels, then this bike might have just ended up looking like just another Red Rocket frame with a big XR500 thumper motor sitting inside. So moving on to the controls department of our Curtis XR, where more or less all of these parts here are just off-the-shelf stock standard motocross components that you can either buy online or maybe over the counter from your local dirt bike parts outlet. And besides these Renthal bars, the rest of the controls, like the grips and the levers and the cables, aren't of course still going to be the same items that Curtis bolted onto this bike in 79, because after 46 years these parts here have probably been changed several times during the bike's life, although these levers and of course the lever covers certainly look like decent quality period correct Magura parts. Although I must say it's quite nice to be able to take a look at one of these rare Curtis bikes again, and as I mentioned at the start of this video, what makes this one here a bit more interesting than many of the other Curtis racers is the fact that this one here is one of the very early Curtis built chassis that were MIG welded rather than the more common practice of being bronze or braze welded. Now, while the owner of this bike, Dougie Harrow, owned and raced this bike at Finhaven in Forfar, he did tell me that it was a fantastic machine to ride, and although this particular XR500 engine wasn't exactly tuned to the max, Dougie still thought that it had more than enough grunt to keep him up there at the sharp end of the pack while he was racing this bike in the pre-1984 Twinshock class. So currently here in 2025, Dougie's no longer the owner of this bike, because he moved the bike on to finance purchase of other off-roaders, but I'd be quite interested to find out who now owns this 79 Curtis racer, and maybe find out what he or maybe even she thinks about the bike. But my guess is that they'll probably have no complaints whatsoever, because these Curtis chassis were well built and very strong, and they did have quite a good reputation for their design and construction, and combining both of these two parameters with this almost anvil strong and unbreakable XR500 engine, it was a winning combination that put many riders at the top step of the podium. And if these kind of four-stroke thumpers are the kind of bikes that you like to ride, then you'll already know just how good this XR500 engine is, because as a scrambles power plant and add that Curtis chassis to the mix, then you've certainly got a bike that's worthy of some of the best riders in the country.